Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a chance to take a look at the next set of readings. I've had a chance to read all of your reflections and take a look at the PowerPoint quiz responses, and it looks like everyone's in pretty good shape. You were clearly thinking about your topics of interest and your research questions and what sorts of methods are going to guide your studies, which means that you're all in good shape. And for those of you who haven't really put together, an introduction or a problem statement yet, don't worry, you're still kind of in a good place. I know that all of you are thinking very carefully about what types of research you want to be engaged in and what types of topics you're interested in. And that's really important. So, as I said in my email, I don't want you to rush through this process because I think, especially for those of you who are newer, it's important to, have a topic that is engaging and interesting enough for you so that you are sustained through the, several semesters that you're going to be working with this project. So during this lecture, we are going to cover research questions, hypotheses building, and the statement of purpose for your paper. Now, so the example that I provided you is a qualitative example in the Blackboard assignment resources section. So for those of you who do plan to use some quantitative methods or are really considering a more quantitative approach to your research, you are doing the same setup, the same format that I've laid out there. However, you might need to add a section for your hypothesis. And so in this lecture, we're going to talk about hypothesis building, and you'll just add a statement right after your research questions and purpose statement, which just highlights what your hypothesis is about your questions. And again, we'll take a look at that during this lecture so you'll understand what that is. Um, so let's get started. If there are questions after the lecture, or if you are still kind of struggling with a particular aspect of your study as you're going forward, again, please feel free to email me with questions. However, I just wanted to also reiterate that I do have office hours. They are Tuesday and Thursdays, 1 to 3 p.m. I'm happy to make an appointment with you to see you on campus if those times don't work best for you. So just let me know sort of what makes the most sense as we're going forward. If you do need more in-person time or you do need a little bit more guidance on any section that we're working with here. So with that said, yes, let's get started with our second session here. So as I said, this week we'll be discussing different types of educational research, and that is a carryover from our last session where we talked about qualitative and quantitative research. Now we'll talk about different approaches or different research approaches. And then we'll also talk about what your reading went over for Chapter 4, which is research questions and hypothesis building, as well as the statement of purpose, as well as the information on how to find and read research articles, and also what to look for in an article critique. So you'll have a couple of resources already available to you on the Blackboard assignment resources section, which kind of go through the process of reading an article, how to find an article that is appropriate for this, and then also a sample of what a critique looks like for a research article. So those are already laid out for you, but I will also be posting a video after this lecture, which kind of just goes through or walks through all the different resources you'll find in that section. And I can see here on your objectives page, there is a little typo. So it should say statement of the purpose, not problem. So I apologize if that causes any confusion, but yes, this week it's statement of purpose, not problem. So with that said, let's get started with these objectives. There are two basic types of research. There's basic and applied research. Basic research is what you would call theoretical research. So this is where scientists or psychologists might develop theories. It's not usually set up for beginning grad students or beginning researchers. Really speaking, in our fields, applied research is what is most often used for the type of research that we do in education. By that I mean research that deals with schools or classrooms or teacher education. These are considered more practical or applied research. And typically for master's students like yourselves, you will be engaging in applied research. Now, under the umbrella of applied research, you can also have different kinds of studies. So there might be a research which is evaluation research. So this really is about programmatic evaluation. So if you're looking for a particular curriculum or a particular program, such as like after school programming, and you're trying to see if it's effective for a particular group of students or participants, this is what we call evaluation research. And some of you might be doing this, especially if you're in school leadership. There may be a leadership program or a particular way of working with a particular group of students that might warrant this type of research. So you might be engaged in some sort of evaluation of methods or ideas that are done, as opposed to action research. So action research is really more about teacher classroom dynamics. So this is really sort of the only one that where you're really engaging with the classroom level, and you're also trying to figure out what teachers or what students really need to help them succeed. And it's more of a dynamic process. So with action research, you're really working very, very closely with the classroom setting, and you're also working closely to figure out, what are sort of the needs or the main problems or issues that come up in the classroom level, and then trying to solve those issues. Now, once you've come up with a general area of interest, it is necessary to then formulate specific research questions, or like we were talking about last week, a problem that you're planning to study. So what is your, area of interest, and then what is, the problem or the main issue that is sort of guiding this particular area of research. And then, as we said, there's these specific steps that you'll take to create your master's thesis or project, which involve reviewing the existing literature or the studies in your field that have already been done, and then to use that as a way to guide your data collection. So in some cases, you may find something that refutes a particular idea, but more often you're going to work with the literature, or you'll have things that sort of back up a particular idea or way of framing things. So typically, you're not finding, these grand findings that like revolutionize the field. But as researchers, what we're doing is we're chipping away at sort of a main issue or problem in our field. So, for instance, right, my dissertation on teacher retention, right, didn't find anything like completely, that blew the field open. But at the same time, I did find a couple of really interesting little tidbits that have sort of pushed us forward a little bit. So for instance, one of my findings had to do with the culture that has developed as a result of programs like Teach for America. So I'll tell you a little bit more about my findings as we get into the data analysis piece of this course. But just to show you that, you don't always have to have a revolutionary topic to have a significant topic. And sometimes it's easier to state a question after you state a question since you'll be analyzing data to find the answer. So, having your questions up front is really critical in the research process. So you don't want to start collecting data and then going backwards, is really what Creswell sort of hones in on. You want to make sure that you have this topic and this problem statement and these questions before you start collecting your data or analyzing your data. So there are some characteristics of good research questions, and obviously these are going to vary a little bit depending on if you do a qualitative, a quantitative, or a mixed methods study, for instance. So A good research question really should have some sort of answer. So whether you're doing qualitative or quantitative data, this is true. You do want to in some way answer the questions which you pose. And that's not to say that there won't be other questions. Oftentimes research that we start delving into will lead to other questions. So it's just important to keep that in mind too. You may not have a concrete answer as you would with a quantitative piece of literature, but you may still come up with something that has, kind of building on an answer to a particular question. So in either case, in quantitative or qualitative research, you should have some sort of answer to your question by the end of your thesis. This topic should also be important to education. Obviously, that's pretty broad, right? You have plenty of opportunities, both, at that action research level where you're doing classroom-based research to, something a little bit more, practice-based or evaluation-based. So those are sort of your areas of research that you're going to delve into, but it should be important to, your particular field, right? So if you're doing a thesis on, for instance, leadership styles, then, you want to frame it in the context of, what are the leadership styles taken by, higher ed professionals, for instance, or what are the leadership styles taken by, principals at the school level, which is therefore pertinent. It should also tell you something about the type of research that you're doing. Okay, so that's what a good question should kind of give you some clues, right, about what type of research is being had through that question. So as you saw from the Creswell chapter, right, there are these templates that you can use to kind of develop a quantitative or qualitative question. And typically when you read a question, you'll have an idea of what types of methods will work best for that question. So really speaking, something that I do want to emphasize here is that having the question first is really important to do before you decide on your methods. And some of you, in your reflections wrote about how you were interested in qualitative or quantitative research, but really let your question guide that particular methodology. So, let your interest area that leads into this question really help you to focus on whether you should be doing a quantitative or qualitative study. It should also tell you about something about the population to be studied. So, you might be working with teachers, you might be working with students in the classroom, you might be working with principals. Whoever your population is, we should know something about them, or something should be revealed through this particular process. And, for quantitative, we're going to talk a little bit about, what is a variable and how do we identify variables that are specific to the study. But questions in general should be very easy and clear to understand. The balance that you have to strike with a research question is really that you don't want it to be too general and you don't want it to be too specific. So as a general rule, quantitative questions use variables. These are numerically measurable and they vary, such as GPA, right? So this GPA will vary across a cross-section of the population, right, for a particular grade level. So 7th graders won't all have the same GPA, and it is something that we can measure. So it does vary. So it is a good variable to use in studies for quantitative questions. Then for qualitative questions, we typically use things such as constructs. So these are more abstract things like beliefs or love or feeling. So these are, things that are a little bit harder to define in just a sentence. And there is literature out there on constructs. So just because it's a construct doesn't mean it can't be defined, but it varies a little bit from study to study. So it's important to understand that there are these differences in the types of questions that you use. And typically, a quantitative question will use variables and a qualitative question will use constructs. So there's a couple of variables that are important when you're thinking about quantitative research. There's independent and dependent variables. At the basic level, these are things that you must definitely know. especially if you're going to be doing quantitative research. Now, the independent variable is an attribute or a characteristic that influences whatever the dependent variable is. And the dependent variable is therefore some sort of outcome or criterion, okay? So you saw a couple of examples of this in the book, right? Your level of sleep is dependent on your exercise, for instance, right? So the more you may exercise, the more tired you get, and then the more you may want to sleep, for instance. Okay, that's a general example. But for those of you who are doing quantitative research, it's important for you to understand independent and dependent variables, because these are the things you're going to have to list when you're doing your studies. There are also, at the basic level, control and treatment variables. So for those of you who are interested in doing some sort of intervention research with your students, particularly if you work with students with autism, right? Typically in our fields of special education, we do have this area of research which is quasi-experimental called single subject research. And in single subject research, we may be trying to modify a particular pattern or behavior that is expressed by a student with autism. And in this case, we'll have what are called treatment variables. So there will be a level of treatment that occurs for the student. And in some cases, this may be an intervention. So one of the studies that I worked on with a group of individuals back at Madison, Wisconsin, was about increasing the level of peer relationships for young children with autism. So one of the things we did was we used a treatment of pivotal response training. That was the name of the program that was used. And so the program really had a significant number of steps which the child with autism and the peer he was playing with would have to take in order to be able to communicate effectively with each other and play on the playground. So this was the treatment variable for that particular study. In this particular case, we try to look at, what is the effect of this treatment when we give the specific concrete steps of pivotal response training to this child versus we leave him alone and then just see what he does. And what we found was, yes, if you give the child concrete steps, if you train the child in a particular peer-based interactive play session, that yes, they are going to be more likely to engage with peers versus if they're left on their own or they're just left to do what they would naturally do, they may not necessarily engage with peers in the same way. So this is the difference between having a control variable where it's a neutralizing piece, nothing is done, versus the treatment where we have some sort of intervention or experiment that's really being measured. Now, control variables in a lot of studies which involve larger groups of people can typically be demographic variables. And again, you can control these pieces, right? So you can have a cross-section of a particular population for a study. You can have it by gender or by race or by age group. These are typically listed as our control variables. Okay, let's practice this just to see if we can get the idea down for the research questions. So let's think about the area of reading comprehension. And everybody obviously has some context with this, having been in education. You may, know this at the special education level. You may have some ideas about it at higher education level, but everybody has some sort of experience with reading. And what we're going to try to do is make an appropriate research question. So think about one for just a minute. Take your time and think about an appropriate reading comprehension research question. The idea that you want to keep in mind is you want to try to make it as clear and as specific as possible. And this is just a good way to practice. So taking a topic and really breaking it down into specific research questions. So let's look at a couple of examples of this. The first example, let's look at a very general question. Why can't kids read? Pretty general, right? We don't know what the context is. Which kids are we talking about? What age are they? What grade level are they in? What are we trying to see about their reading? Is it comprehension? Is it fluency? Is it sight word reading? We don't know. So we have too many other questions from this one broad question. So now let's look at one that's too specific. So why is Juan not interested in reading his story today? Well, so now we only have a small cross-section of the times and days where a study could be possible, right? So if we're only looking at just today and we're only looking at just Juan, then we really don't know anything about the overall context of this question. Now let's look at one that's a little bit better. How about why asking students to act out a story after reading it increases their comprehension at the second grade in second grade ELD students? Okay, so now we have a question in which we can find an answer to. So if they act out a story, are they going to have better comprehension? And this is what kind of a question? What kinds of methods would you employ for this kind of question? If you said quantitative, you're pretty much right. The majority of the questions with this statement does asking the students, if it starts like that, the idea is it's probably going to be a quantitative methods question. So we could actually look at students who acted out a story and compare them to students who didn't act out a story and then see who had better comprehension. This would be an example of something that you could do, which would be a quantitative method. So how about if we looked at this for behavior? So let's talk with a general question. So why are my students always acting up? Again, we don't have enough context, right? Which students? How old? Any disability category? What's the context, right? We don't know. Or if we have a too specific question, why does Mary act out right after lunch? Now we could use this for an action research project, but again, we're only looking at, again, one student and one particular context. The only way that this might be possible is if you do an action research or if you did, just a single subject, in this case, Mary, and look at her lunchtime, activities. But really speaking, it's a little too specific for the majority of you and the majority of the things that you're interested in doing. How about this one? Will a token system, such as positive reinforcement, assist special day class teachers in improving their students' behavior? So now we can look at this token system, and again, in quantitative ways, right? We can measure how will the token system influence the student behavior, okay? Now we could do this qualitatively too, but really in qualitative, we want to look at more of the experiences versus the effectiveness, right? So here we're looking at, is this token system effective in helping the teachers to improve the behavior, right? So that's the difference there. So now you're kind of starting to see that there are differences in the questions, quantitative and qualitative. So let's do another one with the topic of standardized tests. So why can't these students pass the KC? Again, too general. Which students? How old? What demographic area? What type of a school do they attend? How about this one? TJ got a low score on the KC. What can I do about this? Again, this would be a topic which would only make sense maybe for an action research, but in general, it is a too specific question. So again, we only are looking at TJ, and we're only looking at one student and what, who is I in this case, right? We don't really know. It's very, very narrow, and it doesn't give us a whole lot about the particular issue being addressed, which is low scores on the KC, right? We're only seeing the influence of one child, and we're not able to kind of get a broader sense of what might be impeding scores on the KC. So in this case, we have a better question. What is the most effective method of preparing underachieving English-only students to pass the KC? See, that's better. Now we have a specific question that addresses effectiveness. Again, buzzword, right? This word again indicates a quantitative question. And now we have a population of students, English-only students. And we also have a target. We want them to pass the CASE. So now we have a more specific question, but it's not too specific such that it is balanced between these two. Now, for folks who are using quantitative research, there's also this piece called a hypothesis, or plural hypotheses. It is really speaking just a guess, a theory about what the answer to a research question is going to be. Hypotheses are generally only used in quantitative research, and there are two basic kinds of hypotheses. There's a research hypothesis and a null hypothesis. A research hypothesis is what the researcher believes will be the answer to a question based on what they found in the literature. So again, this is where the literature has to be connected into your questions. So if you have a particular idea for a question, it might be a good idea to go back and look at a couple of articles to see what other researchers may have found. This will help you develop a more comprehensive research hypothesis. Now, a null hypothesis is a guess that there will be no significant difference or no relationship between a series of variables. Okay? So, if we looked at that question of behavior and looked at token economies, the null hypothesis would be that there is no significant relationship between doing the token economy system and improved behavior of the students. Okay? That would be the null hypothesis. If you can't think of one, go back a couple of slides and look at our different examples of questions and come up with what the hypothesis would be as a research hypothesis and a null hypothesis. You can do this for all of the examples that we have listed here. The null hypothesis in all cases is really just a statement that says there's no significance, no significant relationship, or no significant difference between the variables that you're looking at. Now here's a question. Why would anybody want a null hypothesis when we're looking for something significant to happen? In general, the null hypothesis is the one that is tested by statistics. So if you've ever taken a basic stats class, you'll know that the null hypothesis says that there'll be no difference or no relationship. The researcher, in hopes of doing the statistics, will show that they can reject the null hypothesis in favor of the research hypothesis, which is what they really want to find. So if we use that example of behavior again, we have our two variables, right? Token economy and then reduced student challenging behaviors in this case, right? The null hypothesis would say, no, there's no relationship between token economies and reduced student behavior. The researcher hoped that they can reject that and say, yes, there is a relationship. In fact, it's a pretty significant relationship. We know that students who use token economies will actually have reduced challenging behaviors. And that's what we hope to find in that particular question. Let's try another example. Here's the question. Will using a computer simulation increase the problem-solving skills of fourth graders as measured by a problem-solving test? Make a guess about what the null hypothesis would look like, and then click on the next slide to see a possible answer. So again, the question was, will using a computer simulation increase problem-solving skills of fourth graders as measured by a problem-solving test? The null hypothesis, again, would negate the relationship or significance. So really, the null hypothesis would say there is no significant difference in problem-solving skills of fourth graders before and after using a computer simulation. So we're saying that the simulation is not going to have any effect on the problem-solving skills. And really, as researchers, we hope to reject that idea. Yes, there should be some sort of effect of computer simulation on the problem-solving skills of fourth graders. So what would a sentence determining this for the research hypothesis look like? So the research hypothesis would be there will be a significant difference in the problem-solving skills of fourth graders after they use that computer simulation. or the problem-solving skills of fourth graders will be higher after they use the simulation using computers. Now, you might be wondering that there are several different kinds of research hypotheses that you can take. You may actually want to say that certain things reduce behavior and certain things increase behavior, right? So how do you know which one to pick for a particular area of study? This is where the lit review or the literature review will probably show what is most likely to happen. So really speaking, it is important for you to be well versed in the area that you're studying of what studies have already shown. And this is what the lit review can do for you. It'll take you back to studies in your particular field to help you see what other people have already done. Now, after we finish this lecture, I'm going to show you a research article that me and several of my colleagues have written, and we'll walk through the different steps of it and go through what the setup of an article looks like. We'll also take a look at the article critique assignment in terms of searching for articles. And I'll take you to the library website as well as Google Scholar so that you have a chance to look at the different ways that we can find articles in our particular area of interest. Now, a researcher can also have a theory of his or her own, and that's totally fine. However, you want to make sure that your theory either is contradicting or going alongside existing literature. So you want to still be, regardless of whether your theory is in line with what's already been done or different than what's already been done, you want to make sure you have a base, and that base comes from those existing studies. Okay, so let's practice one more. Here's the research question. Does the use of student-run peace-building activities decrease the number of fights? Now think about what the null hypothesis and research hypothesis might look like for this particular question. Now the null hypothesis again is saying that there's no significant decrease in the number of fights after a series of student-run peace-building activities. Again, the null hypothesis is saying there's no significance. Now, the research hypothesis, on the other hand, is saying, yes, there is a significant decrease in the number of fights that we see after a series of student-run peace-building activities. How about this one? Does the use of hands-on activities result in higher science test scores for 7th graders? Again, think about what the null hypothesis and the research hypothesis might look like, and then click on the next slide for some possible answers. So again, the null hypothesis says that there is no significant difference in science test scores between 7th grade students using hands-on and those who don't. So when we're comparing two groups, there's still no relationship indicated between the two groups. Now let's look at the research hypothesis. Here are two examples of research hypotheses. The first is there is a significant difference in science test scores between 7th grade students using hands-on activities and those that do not. This one doesn't say which is better or worse. It just says that there's a difference. This one, however, says the science test scores of 7th grade students using hands-on activities are significantly higher than those who do not. So this is taking a stance, right? The first one is just saying that there's some sort of difference. We don't know which way it is. However, the second one is saying, yes, there's a difference, and the difference is that hands-on activities result in significantly higher scores than those of the ones that do not take hands-on. So that's the difference there. You can use it in both ways, right? The research hypothesis doesn't have to pick a side one way or the other, or it can pick a side and say which is actually higher or lower. So now that we've gone over hypotheses and also research questions, it's time to look at the statement of purpose. And again, I apologize that first slide said problem because we did that last week. Now we're looking at the overall purpose of the study. Really speaking, the research statement of purpose advances the overall study. It's usually found at the end of the introduction section. So, really speaking, when we put our papers together, we're going to have a statement that says, the purpose of this study is to blank. And that's where you want to use the exact word for word that I've said here. And remember that the book, Creswell, will actually give you a template for how to set up your research questions and statement of purpose. However, for our purposes, for the proposal that you'll be doing at the end of the semester, you'll want that statement of purpose to come somewhere in your introduction. It could be right after you state, your hypothesis or your prediction. If you're doing quantitative research, it could be right before you state the questions that you're planning to use if you're doing a qualitative study. So it depends on what kind of study you're doing, but it should definitely come in the introduction so that the person reading your paper knows what your whole paper is going to be about. It's a good way to provide a roadmap for the entire study. Now, Creswell did a nice job of distinguishing between things like research purpose statement, the questions, the hypothesis, and the objectives. So these are some terms that are sort of flying around now, right? You last week had heard about research problem statement, and now you're hearing about purpose and questions and hypothesis, and this is just a good way to keep them straight. So the intent of the purpose statement is to provide an overall roadmap or direction for the study. So really speaking, this is the big guideline for your study, okay? It tells us what your study is going to be about. Your research questions are going to raise the questions that you're eventually going to answer through your data. Okay, and just like we looked at, there are different ways of phrasing questions that make them qualitative or quantitative. Now, the hypothesis, which is only in the quantitative, is a making of a prediction about the expectations. And then the research objectives are typically stated goals to be accomplished. Okay? And these are also typically found in quantitative data. In qualitative, we typically don't list objectives. It is, again, a little bit more free-form in some sense, or narrative in some sense. Okay, let's do a little self-check. Which type of educational research focuses on the teacher and his or her own classroom? So take a moment to think about it. Is it basic research, action research, or evaluation research? If you recall from our earlier discussion of the different kinds of research, you would have chosen action research. As we said before, action research is really focused on teachers and classrooms. Now let's look at what of the following is a good research question. You've seen examples now of specific, narrow, and just a good balance between the two. So take a look at these questions. Question 1. Is there a significant relationship between the age of graduate students in education and their GPA? Question 2. Why do some graduate students perform better than others? Question 3. Why does A. Smith always get high grades in her master's classes? You should have recognized that the first question is a very good quantitative question for a research proposal. Is there a significant relationship? Automatically you know that you are looking for a particular kind of relationship between variables. The second question was too general. Why do some graduate students perform better than others? Which graduate students? What university? What kind of relationship are we looking for? It doesn't tell us. And the third question was too specific. We're only looking at A. Smith and her grades in the master's classes as opposed to anybody else's. So now you can kind of see the difference between a general, specific, and a good balance between these two for research questions. How about this one? Which of the following is a null hypothesis? Question 1, or part 1, there is no significant difference in test scores between method A and method B. Part 2, the use of method A will result in higher test scores. Part 3, There is a significant difference in test scores between students whose teachers have used method A and method B. Again, if you chose the first one, you're correct. Remember, the null hypothesis is looking for no significant difference or relationship between variables. Take a look at which of the following is or are research hypotheses. There is no significant relationship between time spent studying and GPA. Students who study longer hours have higher GPAs. There is a significant relationship between time spent studying and GPA. In this case, the last two options would suffice for research hypotheses. Students who study longer have higher GPAs. Yes, we're taking a stance on a particular issue. And the other question, there is a significant relationship between time spent studying and GPA. Both of these are indicating a positionality, whereas the null hypothesis, as we saw, said that there's no relationship. So the answer for this one was 2 and 3. So this concludes lesson 2 from our lecture. So what you'll do now is you're going to go ahead and take a look at the video that I've posted about going through the article critique steps, and then also the video I post about reading a research article.